What if I told you that a single tossed cigarette out of a moving car window on a dry Spanish highway could somehow explain the collapse of the German industrial machine?
I mean, that sounds completely absurd on the surface.
Right. Or what if I told you that a wet swimsuit on a Mediterranean beach is directly connected to a supposedly fraudulent sociology professor at Cambridge University?
Yeah, it sounds like one of those conspiracy boards with red string connecting everything.
Exactly, because most people look at the world and see isolated events like a fire is just a fire, a bad academic hire is just a bureaucratic mistake.
But today, we're looking at how a very specific, deeply cynical, and honestly rapidly growing political movement connects all those dots into one massive, cohesive worldview.
We are essentially going to reverse engineer a political engine today to see exactly how the gears turn. And before we jump in, let's lay down the ground rules for what this deep dive actually is.
Yes, that is so important. So the source material we are digging into today is a transcript from a highly prominent YouTube broadcast. It's from De Telegraaf, which is a major Dutch media outlet.
And it provides this really unfiltered look into modern European conservative sociopolitical commentary, right?
Exactly. But we need to be crystal clear with you, the listener. This transcript is highly opinionated, it is heavily right-leaning, and it's deliberately provocative.
And we are not endorsing these viewpoints.
Not at all.
We are not validating them, and we aren't here to condemn them either. Our mission today is strictly analytical. We are looking at the blueprint of a worldview, not joining the political fight.
Right, because by mapping out this specific argument, you're going to understand exactly how a vocal and really influential portion of the European populace is currently framing the world.
It's an architecture of grievance. It's built on this premise that Western society isn't just stumbling, but actively rotting from the inside out.
And that blueprint takes us from the absolute micro level of society all the way to the macro. It starts with everyday events on your street and scales up to the borders of Europe, elite universities, and even the battlefields of Ukraine.
Okay, let's unpack this, because I want to start right at the micro level with that cigarette on the Spanish highway.
Yeah, that's such a fascinating starting point in the source.
It really is. So the speakers in our source material are talking about a recent vacation they took in Spain, and they describe seeing a brush fire ignite on the side of the road simply because a driver carelessly flicked a lit cigarette out the window.
And what's interesting is their immediate takeaway. It isn't about fire safety, you know.
Yeah.
It's a direct attack on the mainstream media's coverage of climate change.
Right. They specifically point a finger at the NOS, which is the Dutch public broadcaster. They claim that because they physically saw the cigarette start the fire, it proves the climate crisis is overblown.
Yeah, they argue that 90% of all wildfires are caused by human action. The mechanism they use here is crucial. They elevate the immediate, tangible cause over any complex systemic condition.
But the cigarette is just the match, right? I mean, they are completely ignoring the fact that the entire Spanish countryside is soaked in gasoline due to a historic heat wave.
Exactly.
So how do they justify ignoring the macro conditions, like the bone-dry vegetation and the changing temperatures, just to focus on the micro trigger? It feels so deliberate.
It is entirely deliberate, and it serves a very specific epistemological purpose for them. They are validating the common sense observation of the everyday person over the abstract models presented by institutional experts.
Ah, so it's a rejection of expertise.
Totally. They're telling their audience, like, you can trust your own eyes. You saw the guy throw the cigarette. You don't need a meteorologist on the evening news lecturing you about an invisible crisis.
They even bring up a local ice cream vendor with a bell on his cart who's just making a killing because of the heat.
The ice cream guy. I love that detail.
Yeah, because they frame a brutal heat wave not as a symptom of environmental doom, but as this fantastic business opportunity for an entrepreneur.
And they actively mock a mainstream reporter covering a brush fire, claiming she was acting like a war correspondent in a combat zone.
So they are portraying the media as hysteria merchants trying to induce panic, while normal people are just trying to sell ice cream and enjoy summer.
Right. And that tension between the normal everyday citizen and the supposedly hysterical elite, that is the foundation of their entire worldview.
Which they then swing directly toward cultural institutions, because the source transitions from Spain to the canals of Amsterdam, specifically focusing on the Amsterdam Pride Parade.
And their critique here is absolutely brutal. They argue that pride has fundamentally mutated.
Yeah, they say it's no longer about a marginalized group demanding equal rights and wanting to live normally. They explicitly label the modern parade as a freak show.
They cite this specific incident of a man exposing himself, a flasher, to the crowd. And for the speakers, this isn't just one terrible person. They frame it as the defining characteristic of the entire event.
Like society is just expected to swallow this extreme behavior and applaud under the guise of tolerance. But the real flashpoint isn't even the flasher. It's a politician named Esma Lala.
Right. Esma Lala is a prominent alderwoman in Amsterdam, and she wears a hijab. The source details how she attended Pride and a pink sweater to support the LGBTQ community.
And the backlash she faced didn't come from right-wing Christian conservatives. She got severe threats from within Islamic circles for celebrating homosexuality.
And the speakers use this dynamic to totally turn the mainstream progressive narrative on its head. They basically say, look, traditional conservatives aren't the threat anymore.
Right. They argue violent homophobia is now heavily imported from fundamentalist Islamic cultures. They even invent a term for it.
Yeah, the Islamosphere.
Islamosphere, like the manosphere, but for Islamic fundamentalism. It completely shatters the progressive intersectional coalition.
Because she's trapped between the secular expectations of being an Amsterdam politician and the orthodox expectations of her community.
And they are furious that the state won't recognize this threat, which leads to their critique of the police. They describe seeing Amsterdam police officers in full uniform dancing on pride boats.
The uniform is the key detail. They aren't mad about off-duty cops. They're outraged that the physical symbol of state authority is endorsing a specific social movement.
And they draw a parallel between cops partying at Pride and cops attending Islamic iftars in uniform.
Because to the conservative mind, the state must remain neutral to maintain legitimacy. When an officer cheers on a parade or joins a religious ceremony in uniform, the state abandons its neutrality.
They point out that if an average citizen wants to report a burglary or a stolen bike, they get turned away due to capacity shortages.
Right, like there aren't enough officers to take a report.
Exactly. But somehow, the department has the capacity to send cops to party on boats. It creates this narrative of a state that has abandoned its core duties for PR stunts.
And the underlying emotion is a profound sense of losing control. If the state can't neutrally police its own capital, how can it police a national border?
Which takes us right to the geographical edges of the continent. From Amsterdam, the source moves to a tiny Spanish exclave in North Africa called Ceuta, and they describe what happened there as an invasion.
Geopolitically, Ceuta is wild. It's Spanish, so it's EU territory, but it shares a land border with Morocco. It's a physical choke point.
And the source talks about an estimated 50,000 to 70,000 young Moroccan men suddenly surging across that border.
But the focus is really on the massive legal and political hypocrisy of Europe's response. They unpack this through a televised debate between immigration researcher Ruud Koopmans and progressive politician Laurens Dassen.
And Dassen basically says, look, the system works. Spain got it under control. But Koopmans springs a logical trap, doesn't he?
He absolutely does. Koopmans points out that, sure, Spain resolved the crisis, but they only achieved that by engaging in massive, totally illegal pushbacks.
So let's explain what a pushback actually is, because under European law, if you claim asylum on EU soil, you have a legal right to a full procedure. You can't just shove a crowd back across a fence.
Right, but that's exactly what the Spanish military and police did. They ignored international law and physically forced tens of thousands of men back into Morocco.
So Koopmans uses this to highlight the gap between European legal theory and the brutal reality of state survival. You can't have a legal framework that guarantees entry for everyone and still maintain a secure border when 70,000 people arrive at once.
The law demands processing, but reality demands pushbacks. It's the ultimate emperor has no clothes moment. The establishment wants the security of a hard border, but the moral purity of an open asylum system.
And countries like Spain and Italy are forced to do the dirty work, while countries further north, like the Netherlands, pretend the system is still functioning legally.
The source actually characterizes the Netherlands as the naive best boy in class. They follow the rules, even as those rules cause systemic collapse.
And to back this up, they bring in this stunning investigative reporting by Emil Kossen, who infiltrated Telegram groups run by Sudanese migration influencers.
Yeah, these are digital networks with up to 1 million followers. They are actively selling the Netherlands as this asylum paradise, a land of milk and honey.
They literally sell the Dutch welfare state, talking about how you get a free house. The source mentions the free Miele trope.
Ah, yes, the mill. It's a high-end washing machine brand, and it's become this shorthand in Dutch right-wing discourse for the supposedly luxurious treatment asylum seekers get at the taxpayer's expense.
It's the weaponization of social media. And they contrast this naive Dutch approach with Germany, which recently put up strict border controls and dropped asylum requests by 67%.
And Belgium, too. Belgium uses its own digital campaigns to broadcast deterrence messages, essentially saying, do not come here, the system is full.
So Germany locks the door, Belgium puts up a no vacancy sign, and migrants funnel straight into the Netherlands.
And it gets more absurd. The Dutch government tries to send migrants back to Belgium because they pass through there first. But Dutch judges block the deportations, ruling that the Belgian reception centers are too crowded, so it's a human rights violation.
So, because Belgium took a tough stance, their conditions degraded, and the Netherlands gets punished by its own judiciary for maintaining high moral standards. The speakers view this as suicidal bureaucratic empathy.
Which is why they support radical solutions from researchers like Koopmans and Jan van der Beek. They propose permanently revoking asylum rights for anyone who uses a human smuggler.
Instantly and permanently, because the logic is economic. As long as the legal procedure exists at the end of the crossing, the smugglers have a multi-billion-dollar product to sell.
Exactly. If arriving via smuggler instantly disqualifies you for life, the demand evaporates and the crisis ends.
But the critique doesn't just stay in policy papers. They bring it back down to the visual cultural level. They return to the beaches of Spain to create this highly loaded image.
Right, they draw a romanticized contrast. Traditional Spanish evenings, older generations dancing in historic squares, protected by the strict Guardia Civil.
Which implies that the Guardia Civil understands you need hard power to defend culture, unlike the dancing cops in Amsterdam.
And they smash this romantic image against what they see on the beach during the day. They zero in entirely on the visual of the burkini.
They describe a Muslim woman sitting on the sand, layered in heavy black wet fabric, while her husband sits in standard swim trunks. And they frame this not as religious freedom, but as public visual humiliation.
They see it as an aggressive incompatibility with Western democratic values. To them, the burkini is a physical manifestation of women's oppression playing out in a space of freedom.
But this really makes you wonder, where is the line between expecting assimilation and a state enforcing cultural authoritarianism?
Right, like banning clothing.
Yeah, if a democracy dictates what a woman can wear on a beach, aren't they just doing the exact same thing they accuse fundamentalists of doing?
Yeah.
Using state power to police women's bodies?
It's the core of the cultural debate. It brings up Karl Popper's paradox of tolerance. If a society is limitlessly tolerant, its tolerance will be destroyed by the intolerant. The speakers have abandoned limitless tolerance.
They argue civilization has a duty to aggressively defend its core values. When they see the burkini, they see the flag of a hostile ideology planted on a European beach.
And they explicitly remind the audience that Spain was under Islamic rule for centuries, framing this as a slow demographic crusade in reverse. It's existential.
So if the culture is eroding and borders are collapsing, who do they blame? They don't primarily blame the migrants. They blame the gatekeepers of Western society.
Yes, the intellectuals, academics, and policymakers. The accusation is institutional capture. They believe these pillars of society have abandoned objective truth for virtue signaling.
Which brings us to the bizarre case of Jason Arday at Cambridge University.
This story is wild. Jason Arday was a global PR phenomenon, celebrated as the youngest black professor of sociology at Cambridge, with this miraculous backstory of overcoming autism and supposedly learning to speak and read late in life.
Cambridge produced videos touting his hiring as this brilliant sociological mind. But then an investigative journalist started pulling threads, and the whole thing crumbled. His CV was a work of fiction.
He claimed to have run 30 marathons in 35 days, which was totally fabricated. He claimed to have been on a TV show that didn't even exist when he was born. The whole narrative collapsed under basic scrutiny.
But the speakers aren't just pointing and laughing. They're asking a structural question. How does a fraudster get past the rigorous peer review system at Cambridge?
And their answer is a devastating indictment of modern sociology. They claim his academic writing was incomprehensible jargon, tracing the rot back to French postmodern philosophers like Derrida and Foucault in the 1970s.
Right, because those philosophers argued that objective truth is just a myth used by people in power to maintain dominance.
Exactly. And once academia accepts that objective truth is a tool of the oppressor, the immune system breaks down. This prioritizes lived experience over objective data.
So Arde presented a compelling lived experience. He checked intersectional boxes, black, neurodivergent, trauma survivor, and his colleagues were ideologically paralyzed.
They were too terrified of being labeled racist or ableist to challenge his claims. He used his identity as an impenetrable shield.
And the most chilling detail, when the journalist contacted the university, the police reportedly showed up at the journalist's door accusing him of harassment because Arde supposedly needed state protection due to his autism.
The institution used state force to silence inquiry. Arde eventually resigned, but to the speakers, Cambridge's credibility is permanently damaged.
And they contrast this institutional embrace of a fraudster with the treatment of Dutch researcher Jan van der Beek.
He is the anti-Arde, a mathematician studying the net economic cost of non-Western immigration to the Dutch welfare state. But the source claims he is systematically blacklisted from university positions.
Which means he's denied access to the Central Statistics Bureau, the CBS. He's locked out of the data he needs. The accusation is that his mathematical findings are politically inconvenient, so the progressive establishment just unplugs his access.
They go on the offensive against left-leaning academics like Hein de Haas and Leo Lucassen, accusing them of character assassination and making verifiable math errors in their own research just to suppress Van der Beek.
So the narrative is, fake your CV with progressive buzzwords and Cambridge makes you a star, do objective math on open borders, and you're exiled and smeared as a bigot.
It's a complete inversion of what a university should be.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Is it fair to throw out the entire discipline of sociology because of one fraudster? We've seen this in hard sciences, too.
Yeah, like the Sokol hoax.
Exactly. The Sokol hoax in 1996. A physicist submitted a paper of absolute gibberish sprinkled with postmodern buzzwords, and a leading journal published it. It proved the peer review system is vulnerable to jargon, but it doesn't mean studying societal inequality is invalid.
But the speakers argue it's not a glitch, it's a feature. They believe the institution is deliberately re-engineered for ideological conformity, which leads to a form of social policing for anyone who steps out of line.
Which brings us to what the source considers the ultimate proof of this psychosis, the fallout from October 7th. They introduce this incredibly heavy topic through a pop star, Boy George.
It is a jarring entry point. Boy George, who isn't Jewish, released a song called "We Will Dance Again." That phrase is a global mantra of solidarity with the victims of the Nova Music Festival.
He publicly stated his solidarity with Jewish victims of terror, and the institutional backlash was instantaneous. He was dropped from a starring role in Jesus Christ Superstar, his manager quit calling him a coward, and Bandcamp removed the track.
Bandcamp cited a terms of service violation about AI-generated music, which the speakers view as a laughable, bureaucratic excuse to mask ideological censorship.
This isn't just a spat about a pop star. The expert in the source lists examples of a systemic psychosis. Palestinian flags flying from public buildings in rural Spanish villages.
And that unbelievable detail from Ireland, where airlines actively removed Israeli-made anti-fog technology from airplane windshields, sacrificing passenger safety to boycott Israel.
Elite European universities severing ties with top-tier Israeli medical institutions, prioritizing political boycotts over life-saving science. A Dutch civil servant praising Hamas on internal channels.
And a major venue in Utrecht canceling a debate just because the organizers had historical ties to Jewish institutions. The pattern is suffocating institutional conformity.
If you express the wrong solidarity, you are excised from the culture. And the speaker makes this shocking escalation in rhetoric. They compare modern European cancel culture to the ideological brainwashing of 1930s Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia under Stalin.
It's a massive leap. But the speaker making this claim draws on their own background studying Soviet history and visiting the home of dissident Andrei Sakharov in Gorky. They focus on the mechanism of becoming a dissident.
The mechanism of social death.
Exactly. The psychological pressure to conform is identical. In Stalin's Russia, before you got shot, you lost your job. Your colleagues stopped speaking to you. You became a non-person.
So they argue that today, if you stand up for Israel or question progressive orthodoxy on gender or migration, the exact same social mechanisms are deployed. You are fired, canceled, mobbed.
The physical violence might not be a gulag, but the psychological enforcement of orthodoxy is functionally the same. They're diagnosing a society-wide groupthink.
How does a society that built the Anne Frank house flip to a point where Jewish tourists are attacked, an institution side with a terror group that wants to eradicate Jews?
They explain this through ideological inversion. The progressive left has categorized the world into a rigid binary of oppressors and oppressed.
Nuance is impossible. Israel is successful and backed by the West, so it's the oppressor. Palestinians are less powerful, so they are the oppressed.
And once that framework is locked in, facts don't matter. Even a live-stream terror attack is reinterpreted as decolonization or resistance. Civilian victims are dismissed as colonizers.
It's a collective delusion where institutions can no longer distinguish right from wrong. And this ideological blindness doesn't just affect domestic culture, it leads to catastrophic geopolitical blunders.
Which brings us to the war in Ukraine. The speakers look at Ukraine and declare the Western strategy a total failure built on lies.
They tear down the mainstream narrative that Ukraine is winning and Putin is on the brink of collapse. They present a grim reality check.
Russia controls most of the Donbas region. Ukraine is effectively out of advanced air defense missiles.
And there's severe internal turmoil. Zelensky firing popular commanders for telling the truth about the battlefield, draft protests, massive corruption, like the official who allegedly fled to Israel with millions in stolen funds.
But they also focus on the economic blowback hammering Western Europe, specifically Germany's deindustrialization.
Because Germany's industrial machine relied on cheap Russian natural gas delivered through the Nord Stream pipelines. Once those were destroyed, the economic model ended overnight.
Factories are shutting down or relocating because energy is too expensive. The source hints that the German government secretly wants Nord Stream repaired because they realize they're committing economic suicide.
And this feeds into their big stick critique of Western diplomacy. They blame Western idealists, specifically naming Carl Bildt and Radoslaw Sikorski as anti-Russian hawks who poked the bear.
The West invited Ukraine into its sphere of influence with EU integration promises, but expanded right up to Russia's border without a credible military threat to back it up.
It's like the EU poked a heavily armed bear with a bureaucratic pen, but forgot to bring a shotgun. They promised protection on paper, but when Putin called their bluff, the West stood on the sidelines because they weren't prepared for an industrial war.
It's a brutal critique of soft power arrogance. You can't deter an autocrat with UN resolutions or sanctions. You can only deter him with the certainty of military annihilation.
So the current strategy of drip-feeding weapons is just destroying Ukraine while bankrupting Europe, which leads to their proposed solution. Pure, ruthless geopolitical realism.
They argue current leaders are too captured by moralistic rhetoric to end the war, so Donald Trump is the only one who can force a bitter compromise.
They say Ukraine must permanently cede the Crimean Peninsula to Russia and negotiate a special autonomous status for the Donbas. Zelensky has to be forced to accept that the war is unwinnable.
It's a total rejection of moralistic framing. Forget international law, forget sovereign borders, forget punishing the aggressor. Look at the reality of the map and the crumbling German economy and make a deal before the country is leveled.
It makes you wonder how often you seek out uncomfortable realism over comforting idealism when consuming news. Is telling Ukraine to surrender territory waving the white flag, or is it the only way to save the rest of the country from becoming a crater?
It's an impossible choice between moral high ground and brutal pragmatism.
And that tension brings us to the synthesis of this entire deep dive. We've spent this hour inside a very specific, interconnected worldview. To these speakers, the world isn't a series of isolated events. It's a cohesive narrative of civilizational decline overseen by a delusional elite.
It's all connected in this architecture of grievance. The cigarette in Spain proves the climate crisis is a hoax. The fake professor proves institutions are destroyed by postmodernism.
An alderwoman at Pride is linked to Boy George getting canceled, which is linked to geopolitical miscalculations in Ukraine.
It's built on the belief that Western institutions traded pragmatic survival, like secure borders and hard military power, for ideological virtue signaling.
It is an incredibly dark view of the present, but it's actively reshaping political discourse across Europe. Understanding it is essential whether you agree with it or find it repulsive, because this counter-narrative is dismantling the post-war liberal consensus in real time.
Absolutely.
But I want to leave you with a final paradoxical thought to mull over. The speakers in our source view themselves as brave dissidents speaking truth to a powerful establishment. But consider this. When an anti-establishment worldview gains millions of followers, when it controls massive telegram networks and media ecosystems, and establishes its own rigid orthodoxies, at what point does the counterculture become its own kind of rigid groupthink?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question.
If you're just reflexively repeating the cynical talking points of the anti-establishment and blaming elites for everything from a brush fire to a war, are you really a free-thinking dissident? Or have you just traded one set of ideological blinders for another? Perhaps the ultimate rebels are the ones who refuse to blindly align with either side's strict orthodoxies. The ones who can look at a crowded beach and, at least for a moment, just see sand, water, and people. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us today.